Welcome. In this video, we're going over the idea of plastic deformation within bones in order to reshape bones after puberty. And this is done to grow taller, of course. So let's get into it. What's all the hype about? The main idea is that bone has plasticity, and things with plasticity can change shape with enough time and enough pressure. Some examples are corsets, foot bindings done in China, Devin Larratt's arms. He's a professional arm wrestler in his late 40s now, and his right arm grew longer as a result of excessive training over a 2-year period. I know the image is flipped, but this is his right arm here. We've also got orthodontic braces. It might be a little bit different, right? The plates of the skull versus like an arm or leg bone, but the concept is still the same. Forces can reposition or change the shape of bones. And then we've also got the idea of rickets, which is a disease where a lack of nutrition causes bowing of the leg bones because the body can't support its own weight due to gravity and the bones bend. Bone lengthening is possible over long periods of time. I will get a little more into this later. And I also run some numbers at the end just for plausibility's sake. And I take those numbers from an MIT study done back in 2009. So it's a more sciencey video today. There will be a lot of numbers, some physics, technical terms, so you might want to get ready for that. And it might also be a longer video just because there's more to discuss and more to explain. Let's get into it. So let's start by quantifying bone. Bone is made of 60% hydroxyapatite, which is calcium and phosphorus, 25% proteins. This one's mainly collagen, the same stuff that our cartilage is made from. 10% water, 5% cells. That'll be your osteoprogenitors, blasts, clasts, and cytes. Now the MIT paper that I'm referencing, I'll throw down below. It's titled Plasticity and Toughness in Bone, and they provide a few really good quantifications for bone. They provide the elastic modulus, or the stiffness of bone, to be 15 to 25 gigapascals. They measured the onset of plastic deformation to require a few hundred megapascals, and they also quantified fracture toughness in a range of 3 to 10 megapascals times the square root of meters. I don't know why the units are so strange, but the fact that they were able to quantify this kind of stuff allows me to do measurements later on. So let's go over some key terms, otherwise you might get lost later. Bone mechanotransduction. Bone cells experience mechanical loads, so basically running, jumping, lifting weights, some sort of load on the bone, and then these signals are sent to encourage bone remodeling and growth. This cycle of resorption, formation, resting, activation, all that, it just cycles through. Now, what is bone remodeling, right? I use it in the definition of mechanotransduction. So bone remodeling is the continuous bone resorption and formation as a result of stress, right? We're adapting to stress, and so we're constantly laying down new bone or taking away old damaged bone. That's what bone remodeling is. And basically, you can sum it up as repairs to the micro damage that's being caused. Now, within all these micro damages, callus is being formed, right? A callus formation. This is soft tissue that forms when the bone is damaged, and this occurs in the early phase of bone healing. So calcification doesn't happen now, it happens a little bit later into the process when the bone actually hardens and actually matures. Now let's get into the second slide of key terms. I promise there's only 2 slides. So we've got endochondral and intramembranous ossification. These are the only 2 real ways to grow bone within the body. Endochondral ossification is like during puberty, we're growing out our growth plates. We lay down a cartilage template, and that cartilage template gets filled in with actual bone. So an example would be our long bones within the legs, for example. We've got intramembranous ossification. This skips the cartilage stage and goes directly from tissue to bone. An example would be our skull. That's how it forms. Now, last term here, distraction osteogenesis. This one might seem kind of fancy, but it just describes limb lengthening surgery. So it's a surgical means of separating the bone and then lengthening it. And this uses intramembranous ossification to grow back that bone. So we start with an osteotomy to surgically cut the bone. Distraction just means we take a device called an external fixator to pull the bones apart, right? Like in this diagram right here, typically at 1 millimeter per day, but this number can vary based on the person. And then osteogenesis just means bone creation, right? Bone creation, or the regeneration of bone. So we start with that callus formation, and then in 2 to 6 months, that new bone hardens and matures and becomes actual bone, and it's a permanent change. So with all the sciencey, mumbo jumbo out of the way, I'm hoping that you can see things are starting to fall into place, right? If we can mimic distraction osteogenesis, which is what I intend to do with micro damage to the bone plus banded sleeping, then I can grow at a slower rate with a lot less pain, and this won't really interrupt my daily activities. And just to be clear, MIT did not say that you can grow taller after puberty. This is my claim, but I can extrapolate from their numbers and their findings in order to perform some calculations. So let's get into those. Pre-calculation terminology, otherwise you won't understand what the heck I'm doing with my numbers. So stress is force per unit area, right? The actual stress being applied to the bone. Strain is the deformation, or that change in shape of the bone. Elastic deformation is temporary. So whenever you see elastic, you can kind of think of like elastic bands, elastic whatever. Basically, once you stretch it, it'll go back to its original shape once the stress is removed. So you can see that's the first phase here on this stress strain graph, elastic deformation. It's governed by Hooke's law, right? The same thing that governs springs. You can pull a spring apart, but then that spring will go right back to its original shape once the stress has been removed. It's calculated as stress equals elastic modulus. This one will be from the MIT paper, times strain. So basically, bone bends. Once stress is removed, it regains its original shape. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's move on to plastic deformation. This is a more permanent change. And basically, once you pass a certain threshold of stress, the bone will change shape. So it's that yield point right here. When we transition from elastic to plastic, we pass that yield point and boom, the bone will permanently change shape. This is basically what we want, but on a much smaller scale, right? We don't want to bend the bone permanently within like 2 seconds. That's going to lead to health complications. Now, if we go too far, it'll crack because we'll reach that fracture point right here. And that results in something called a stress fracture, which you may already know about from friends, family, or maybe like teachers, someone at school. So let's run those numbers. Remember, the bone elastic modulus, also known as the stiffness, is between 15 and 25 gigapascals. I'll take the middle of that range, so just 20 gigapascals. That's similar to aluminum, which is really, really tough. Like, we're not talking aluminum foil here. We're talking an actual bar of aluminum. So we'll use 20 gigapascals. Bone strength, which is defined as the onset, or like the beginning of plastic deformation. This is a few hundred megapascals. So we'll take 300 megapascals for the calculations later, just a few hundred. And then just to give you an idea of the scale of these numbers, because they're truly massive, 100 megapascals, which is a far cry from gigapascals, is 14,500 pounds per square inch. So just huge, huge forces at play here. Now let's get into the calculations. Let's assume the cross-sectional area of a femur is 3.5 centimeters squared, and for a tibia, it's 2.5 centimeters squared. The femur is that larger leg bone up top, and the tibia is that smaller leg bone in your shin area. So let's go with elastic deformation first, that temporary change in bone at a 0.1% strain, right? Super, super small deformation. So first we need to calculate stress as the elastic modulus times strain. So 20 gigapascals, the middle of this range, times that 0.1% gives us 20 megapascals. Now that we know the stress, we can throw it into the equation. So the force required for the femur can be calculated as pressure times cross-sectional area, and that will give us 7,000 newtons, or 1,573 pounds of force required for a small bend within the femur. So huge, huge force. We do the same for the tibia at a smaller cross-sectional area, still comes out to 1,124 pounds. Huge numbers, like I'm saying, but there is a way around this, and I will explain that in just a moment. Let's go into plastic deformation, which is what we actually want. And I said earlier, we're assuming a yield point of 300 megapascals. Now, the force required to plastically deform the femur is, again, the pressure, 300 megapascals, times the cross-sectional area of 0.0035 meters squared. That gets us 105,000 newtons, or 23,600 pounds. So, there's pretty much no way to apply that much force on the human body without ripping something or without killing the person, right? So we want to avoid this at all costs. But this is just a number for, imagination's sake. Now with the tibia, it comes out a little bit less at 16,800 pounds. So I know these are overly simplistic calculations, right? We're just using Hooke's law here, super simple, but it's a sanity check. The numbers suggest that purely applying stress to the bone will not work, right? The tendons, ligaments, that stuff will just tear first. Bones are very durable. However, certain things haven't been factored in yet, right? Like microfractures and duration, right? Microfractures I'll talk about in a second, but these are really hard to quantify, right? How many you have and the extent at which your legs are microfractured. But duration, if you think about braces work over a period of months or years, right? The teeth don't shift like in an instant. So that's kind of what we're calculating here, right? Plastic deformation instantly would require this much force. But what if we drag that out over a long period of time? Things start to look a lot different. So let's go over the MIT paper opening statement. Basically, they say that the bones are full of microscopic cracks and that the bone is remarkably resistant to fracture. So with all these microscopic cracks, the need for such high tension forces may vanish because of these microfractures. It's like splitting a log. If you had a naturally existing crack within that log and you just basically focused in on that crack, the job is a lot easier. So I don't think I can do the calculations for this, in my opinion, just because microfractures are so complicated and they're so varied, but I'm hoping this just gives you some hope as to how all of this is possible. So some crazy ideas. These are not medical advice. This is just for imagination's sake, right? Up here to get results. It's to lessen the tension force required for plastic deformation over time, of course. I'm assuming you don't need hundreds of pounds of force, thousands of pounds of force if you have time on your side. So I can't speak of the negative long-term effects of pursuing all of these options, but they're just ideas, right? You can build off of them constructively or negatively. They're just ideas. So 1, to weaken the bones internally by lowering bone mineral density. You can do this through zero physical activity, having a poor diet which lacks calcium, phosphorus, collagen. You can drink a lot of alcohol, drink a lot of caffeine. So this stuff will lower bone mineral density, and similar to osteoporosis, your bones become weaker because they become less dense. So this would lessen the tension force required for plastic deformation. You can also increase the microfractures with some sort of hammer or shin kicking. This is similar to the idea of bone smashing, which increases bone turnover rates. Again, none of this is being advised. This is just for imagination's sake. Second slide of this, I've got 3 slides of this, by the way. So second slide, we can inhibit estrogen and boost HGH, naturally or unnaturally, of course. And this will maximize osteoclast activity, right? We're maximizing the amount of bone we're taking away. But if we can find that good balance point where we elevate our osteoblasts, the cells that put bone down as well, then we can strike this really fast bone turnover rate that will just help with reforming the bone even faster. You can also use copious amounts of vitamins C, D, and E. Again, bone metabolism, speed up orthodontic rate, that turnover rate. You can try stem cell therapy to add bone faster. You can try and do this when the bones are young and still developing. That's why they advise that you try mewing when you're super young, because after a certain age, sutures fuse, bones are a lot harder to move around and shift around within the face. Now, foot binding is an example. It's a gruesome example, but basically you'll grow into the small shoe and that natural deformation happens, right? The foot grows smaller simply because growth was restricted. Same idea with corsets, even though these things can be done later on in life. Now, what if we reverse the idea and basically put strain on the bone? The bone would kind of just grow up only knowing that situation of like being stretched, right? So it will undergo natural deformation because its growth was pushed a certain way. Hopefully that makes sense. Another reason why you would want to do this while the bones are young is because bone density increases slowly into your late 20s. So there's this shift from like super low bone mineral density or like relatively low bone mineral density to higher bone mineral density. And if we can exploit this, we can probably see faster changes. Now, last slide of crazy ideas, we would put clamps on the bone for more direct stretching, right? With distraction osteogenesis, they actually had rods implanted into the bones in order to pull them apart. And they focused on the bone rather than like ligaments and all that kind of stuff. 7, go heavy on the squats and deadlifts. I don't recommend this because it compresses the spine a great deal, but you can create maximal damage with all these heavy compound movements and create more microfractures. 8 is to hop on the keto diet. Saturated fats will lend the bones and your facial sutures higher plasticity, so you'll find that bones are easier to change and morph simply because you have more saturated fats within your body. And then 9 is to use ratchet straps instead of elastic bands, and ratchet straps are kind of the cranking straps where you can kind of do one crank on this side, one crank on the other side, and it's a more reliable and consistent way of progressively overloading in the future. So I wanted to show this one testimonial. Pygmy, he's like a YouTuber who made a banded sleeping video. I forgot what he called it. It's like a sleep table or something, but he didn't call it banded sleeping. He called it something else. But the goal was to grow taller over like 10 days by doing this 1 hour per day. Obviously it didn't work, but a lot of comments said they found success in a similar method. And I just wanted to share some of those comments because these are testimonials, right? They're people who actually tried this and succeeded. So we've got Timur saying, well, it works. You just need a little more time, at least 2 months. Increase gelatin intake as it aids bone formation and helps maintain morning height. Supplement with glucosamine, D3 and K2 to accelerate progress. It worked for me and I'm way past puberty. Grew 2 inches in 6 months. That's pretty crazy stuff. So he goes on to say, currently 26 years old, I was lucky enough to have an Olympic pool right next to my home, so I started swimming. It was just backstrokes when I started, like 50 meters, but now I do 200-meter freestyle swimming, usually 2 to 4 times a week. I also do skipping pretty regularly, but I keep it short, 10 to 15 minutes in the evening. The idea is to jump as high as possible to create microfractures in the femur and tibia and heal bones in an elongated state. Take ankle weights or rubber bands and hang or stretch your legs for at least an hour. Some people go as far as banded sleeping, but for me, it's inconvenient. I agree with that. I do banded sleeping every night. It's not super convenient, but I think it will work a lot better than just an hour a night. And lastly, your nutrients should aid bone formation, so drink raw farmer's milk, egg yolks, bone broth or gelatin powder, like he said up here, and carrots. So I absolutely agree with pretty much everything Timur just said, and I'm actually implementing everything except the swimming part and the jump rope part, just because I do running and Maasai jumps instead. Now, some other people on that same YouTube video gave their own testimonials, and I know these are just YouTube comments, but given their anonymity, right, they don't have channels, they have no incentive to lie or tell the truth. I don't think they're lying, but that's for you to decide. Now, the first guy says, it does work. I've grown 8.5 centimeters with methods similar to these in the span of 1.5 years. I'm 24. We've got the second guy saying, you're wrong. This is a working method, but it only works for teenagers. I'm 17 and gained 4 centimeters using leg weights. Third guy says you need to do the leg stretching straight before bed in order to let the microfractures calcify. That's what I do and it works for me. I'm 16. I went from 6 foot to 6'1". So hopefully these testimonials give you some hope that this stuff is achievable. It just has to be done in the right way and it can be done at any age. So on a last note, I just want to say that doctors aren't always right. If you know who Eddie Hall is, he's this strong man who just does incredible feats of strength. And his doctor said you can't ever physically lift 500 kgs. And he proved them wrong. I'll share this YouTube short down below. I'll just link it. But doctors just aren't always right. So I want to say, let's keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. That's the only way that new stuff like this gets discovered. I'm not the first pioneer, right? There's people who have already done this kind of stuff. I'm just continuing the work that other people have started, and I'm adding my own ideas, my own research to all of this. Some sources I'll link down below. With that said, thank you for hanging out. Like and sub for more. Peace.